We welcome our next speaker. We keep our busy tempo. This is Purvi Shah talking about disruptive lawyering.
Hi, how's everyone doing? Yeah? We're a small group, so if you feel compelled to come to the front, I would not mind that. So my name is Purvi Shah. I'm sort of an odd person to be at this conference. I'm a civil and human rights lawyer. I've been doing that work for about 15 years, and I think part of the reason why they asked me to speak today was I've been spending about a decade thinking about how do we transform lawyers. Lawyers who have primarily been trained in a skill that's been used to, I think, preserve the status quo. How do we build a cadre of lawyers that actually understand how to transform our society? And so I got invited to speak here after I spoke at something called Data for Black Lives, which was a gathering in the United States of data scientists, technologists that were concerned with the questions of social justice and of Black Lives Matter. I'm also the founder of something called Law for Black Lives, which I'll tell you a little bit more about, which is a national network of 3,500 lawyers in the United States that are committed to the questions of justice, and particularly around challenging anti-Black racism. So I wanted to just offer a couple of maybe caveats to the talk. One, I feel I'm certainly an outsider. It's been very interesting to observe this space. There are a lot of places for possible collaboration, but there's also a lot of lessons, I think, to share from kind of being the countercultural people within a field. And so I'd like to offer some of that. The second thing I'll say is that I'm going to offer my thoughts in the spirit of honesty. You may not agree with everything I say. I come from this from a very different lens and a different training and a different context to my work, but I'd encourage you guys to try it on, at least for the next 13 minutes. Okay, so let me get started. So I wanted to start with telling you about 3 stories of heartbreak within the law. And I think that's really important because a lot of what shaped my understanding of the law has come from these stories. The first one, it starts in my first year of law school. And for most of you that don't know, in law school, in our first year, we have core curriculum. One of our core curriculum is learning about property law. I'm a young woman of color, first-generation American, identify as an immigrant, and in my first year of classes, I read a case called Johnson v. McIntosh. And this is sort of celebrated as the origins of American property law, and the entire case basically lays out the reasoning for why Native people could lay no claim to their land. And it was the idea that colonizers had the ability to claim finders keepers. And this arcane old case is essentially the scaffolding upon which all other legal jurisprudence around property is set. And this was an enormous moment of heartbreak. We didn't discuss that context. We sort of read it and sort of zoomed right past it. And I think for me, it was this moment of thinking, I came to law school to learn about justice, and instead I was learning about oppression, right? Rules and regulation of oppression versus rules and regulation of justice. The second moment of heartbreak was when I became a lawyer. I joined the field and I was a legal services lawyer, a lawyer for the public interest. And I worked in providing free legal services for extremely low-income people, particularly tenants, workers, taxi drivers, immigrants. And one of the things I realized, and I was super elated when I won my first case. I said I had an eviction case, I was able to keep somebody in their home, and I was super elated. And that moment sort of deflated very quickly when I saw that same person 4 times over the next year and had to defend them in 4 more evictions, right? So it started to have me ask this question of like, what is my purpose? What is the institution I'm working in? Is it actually solving these problems? Or am I just am I part of a revolving door of crisis where I put Band-Aids on hurting people? But second, is my profession actually totally designed to profit off of this? All of our jobs are dependent on suffering continue. So second moment of heartbreak as a young lawyer, which was now quite a while ago. My third moment was, how many people recognize the name Michael Brown? Nobody? Oh, someone in the back. Great. A few people. So Michael Brown was a 18-year-old young African-American man from the town of Ferguson, Missouri, who was shot down by the police unarmed, and his body was laying in the street for 4 hours. While they tried to figure out what went on. And this was an enormous moment in the United States that happened about 3.5 years ago. 4 years ago now and it created an enormous eruption around racial tension in the United States. And we saw weeks and weeks of protests. I ended up going to Ferguson about 3 days after Michael Brown was killed. And the reason why I went is that there was tons of civil society and people protesting, and they were being met with militarized police violence, with tear gas. All of us were tear gassed multiple times out there. And the reason why this is a moment of heartbreak for me was that the entire, this whole situation was around police and their ability to feel fear, particularly when it came to black men. And the idea that killing an unarmed person, an extrajudicial killing, is actually illegal. But there was all these loopholes in the law. If a police officer felt any sort of fear, they had the right to shoot a person down, or it was reasonable for them to shoot someone down. Another moment of heartbreak, and a moment of heartbreak for many young African-American black lawyers in the United States that were learning the law and at the very same moment realizing it offered no protection for our people. So I think I tell you these stories because I think these moments of heartbreak can also be viewed as contradictions. And I saw these moments of contradiction really toppling this sort of mythology of the law, a mythology that probably extends to each of you, right? We have a sort of hegemonic idea about law. And I think there are 3 myths that are sort of very commonly understood or believed about law. First, that law equals justice. And the reason why that's not true is there are so many things that happen to communities that are not actually legal. It's not illegal to certain environmental hazards. We don't deem them illegal to displace them only on communities of color. There are, this issue of police violence. Even though it is illegal to kill an unarmed person, we have a standard that says if it's reasonable, the law permits it. So we have to sort of first dispel this idea and this mythology that law equals justice. Second, that lawyers and law create social change. And I feel like this is really critical. And some of these myths might mirror the mythology of data or technology, right? So that lawyers and law create social change. We have seminal civil rights cases in the United States where we would win massive victories in the courts around the right to education, you cannot discriminate against someone based on the basis of their race, and the reality is our schools are more segregated and unequal today than they ever were. Right, so something about the law is actually not transforming society. And third, that the law is neutral, fair, and objective, which is sort of an idea that is pumped into all of us and is just absolutely not true. And I tell you that after 15 years of studying, teaching, working, litigating within the law. So I think these myths, or contradictions as I'd like to call them, I think they offered me 2 insights about social change. And for those of you that are interested in using data or technology for social change, I think these learnings are pretty important. First is that to change the world, we have to deal with the question of power. Right? It's not enough to actually change a material condition. If someone's saying the major problem in my society is that I can't get access to sort of healthcare, just simply making it easier to get that doesn't address the myriad of other things that person does not have access to, right? So service delivery or access doesn't resolve the question of power. So for me and for a lot of our lawyers, we had to transform our thinking to be really interested in the question of power. The second thing, and I'll sort of leave this for you all to read, I won't go through each point, but it was a series of additional learnings about the fact that it's not enough to say that we want to transform the world. I think we have to understand that power relationships in society are unequal, and that's systemic. It's baked into a lot of our institutions. It's baked into the laws. It's baked into the way the world operates. And so if you're interested in solving social change, you have to get at this question of power. The second piece of learning I had was that social movements made of people most directly impacted by justice have been the engine of that change. And that may sound odd to a group of people who really feel that exponential technology or that with information and data and knowledge, we can rapidly solve problems. I don't think you can do that without connecting to the everyday person that is struggling on those issues. So even though we've had these insights, then it was a question of all of our socialization, all of our training as lawyers. We were trained to be elitist. We were trained to not actually see ourselves as having the answers and as working with clients, right? Which is probably similar terminology, users, consumers. And one of the biggest learnings we had when we talked to social movement groups was that lawyers actually didn't address the question of power. In fact, we usually made it worse because we would parachute in and try to solve the problems. And so that helped me and a bunch of other similar lawyers develop a new approach to lawyering called movement lawyering. And the movement lawyering has, I think, 3 defining qualities. And I offer this again as perhaps could we think about movement technologists? Could we think about movement data scientists? How could we adopt an additional identity, a purpose, and a value that guides us as a compass as we utilize our skills? So we redefine success to not just be changing the material conditions of people's lives, which is essential. If I'm not improving someone's lives, if I'm not stopping the flow, if I'm not improving their situation when it comes to healthcare, jobs, education, I'm not solving that problem. But at the same time, I'm not just interested in that. I'm interested in transforming a person's sense of their own power and also altering broader power relations in society. So if you were to adopt this framework for your work, how might this change how you approach your work? So as I have a few minutes left, but I wanted to share with you probably just a few pieces of wisdom, and I leave them to you to think about how they may resonate or not resonate. So Law for Black Lives, one major insight I had was that I've spent 15 years trying to change the legal profession. I've been a law professor, I've started 3 legal organizations, I've trained thousands of people across the country and in 16 countries around the world. And what I realized is that if you're trying to change an industry, it's really important to make interventions at the individual level, but it's also really important to sort of make interventions at the field level. So Law for Black Lives was an intervention at the field level. We had a crisis moment in which thousands of people across the United States, we had 140 cities that were erupting in protests and in all sorts of questions about the sort of immediate issues of police violence, but also the long-term issues of sort of systemic violence that people were dealing with. And we built this organization as a channel for lawyers that were based at all different types of institutions, whether they were in firms or in technology companies or in the legal services or the public interest to come together. And from that, we had a bunch of lessons. First, it's pretty important to diagnose the problem accurately. I've heard a lot of diagnosis of problem, and I find that it's often at the symptomatic level. How do we get to the radical root of what is causing these problems? And I think you can't answer those questions without looking at things like racism. I've not heard the word racism in the last day and a half here. And I'm confident that it is occurring not only within this space, but it is also occurring right outside these doors, and it is occurring in all of the issues that you work on. So where are we diagnosing the problem? Is the problem people don't have access to food, or is the problem that is based on your race and your identity and your value and your worth in society? Second, solve the problems people want you to solve. All of us who have higher education and training and skills, we're socialized to think we have an exceptional piece of, an exceptional brain, exceptional insight and wisdom. And we do, but I actually believe there are people who have been resisting all sorts of problems for thousands of years. And there is deep wisdom within that. So why don't we start, instead of parachuting in with our big ideas, how can we start by building authentic relationships and trying to partner with communities? So I say that because oftentimes the refrain when I say I work with social movements is, well, those movements don't know what they want. They're just very decentralized or abstract, and it's just not true. And as an example, 100 groups in the United States came up with a platform called the Vision for Black Lives. And if you work in the United States, I encourage you to read it. And it lays out in great detail 40 points of change that they want in their community, from the tax laws to immigration to ending mass incarceration to getting rid of prisons. So how can you actually work to solve for those problems? Third, no rogue agents and no savior complexes. And this is a tough one because it requires us to be self-reflective, and it requires us to have a little bit of humility about what brings us to this work. And there's something enormously gratifying about being useful in the process of change, but you cannot get that twisted with feeling like you are saving other people. I think this really shifts when we shift who is designing, who is lawyering, who is creating the technology. And so I think this comes back to the previous speaker's points, Chris's points about diversity. this is really important, centering the people that are most proximate to pain and suffering. And that's a frame that I borrowed from Brian Stevenson, who is an incredibly well-known civil rights lawyer in the United States. And for me, this is really about, whose voices are centered. This is it's been a very enlightening space to be in. But we've talked a lot about the problems of farmers and, people who don't have access to healthcare and refugees, and I'm not really seeing them necessarily in this space. And so how can we design a society for people to thrive when those people are not allowed to have a vision in that process? So how do we center the people most proximate to pain and suffering? And that's a lesson we had to learn within the law as well. And it also brings me back to who's allowed to be disruptive, the most sort of overused word, right? But, in Gaza, people marching right now, that is disruptive, but we don't think that that's appropriate disruption. The disruption that is contained in your labs and in your boardrooms and in our courtrooms, that type of disruption is acceptable. But when a black or brown person disrupts for the sake of their lives, that disruption is somehow inappropriate. So really kind of interrogating how we center those. I have just a few more, and I'm out of time, but I'm going to indulge you in allowing me to finish. So redefining values and ethics. And I've heard a lot about this, and it's very exciting because we're trying to do the same thing within the law, rewriting our codes of professional responsibility. It's not just ethics for particular product. I'm hearing a lot about ethics for AI, ethics for automation, which I think is great. But how do you as a field think about redefining ethics? There are no ethics for data or technology. You don't have a licensing. You don't have a professional responsibility. Well, what would it look like if this group of people wrote a code of ethics? And it could be vague, and it will live, and it will adapt, and it will change. But the idea that we build a North Star for what our interaction with communities on these problems could look like. Also, I'd encourage people to think about solving for aggregating problems, solutions, and resistance versus atomizing them. So not just how do we improve service delivery or access to something, but then how do we collect people who are all in a similar situation together so that they can actually fight on that issue together. And technology can play a huge role in aggregating people who are facing similar problems. And in that way, you can be a big part of building the power of social movements. The speaker this morning talked about this really, I think, extensively, but the idea that emotions are greater than or equal to certainly law, data, or technology. How do we see the heart as a data point? How do we move at the speed of trust? Sometimes we're so interested in solving problems, we don't care how we get there. But if we really are thinking about the problems of society, of bias, of inequality, as actually being baked into our culture and our values, we're going to have to slow down and move at the speed of trust, because otherwise we're not resolving those. You'll have to create a new product to solve another problem, right? So how do we get to that? And the last piece, movements lead to moonshots. This is a new term I learned. I have a dear friend who works at Google, and she's talking to me about how she's going to work in the moonshot lab. And I was like, what in the world is that? And then I had an insight. The idea that a slave could revolt, that was part of a disruptive idea. The idea that the civil rights movement in America could drastically go from Jim Crow segregation, in which blacks and whites were not allowed to sit in the same spaces, to radically being able to undo that in a short period of time. That was a moonshot, right? So it's like we have this idea that technology and data are the things that are going to rapidly leap us forward on these problems. And I would argue that people organized, resisting together, are necessary ingredient to getting to that moonshot. Harriet Tubman, I oftentimes believe, was an innovator. So part of my work has been to build a new generation of legal visionaries, and that it is a mix of different skill sets. It's about being a brilliant lawyer, but it's also about understanding history and social movements and being a student and being humbled to not think that our skill or trade offers all of the answers. And I really welcome you all to think about that. I think the last thing I'll say, and I've gone far over, and I appreciate the patience, but I would like to not de-emphasize what an important moment we are in. We are in a moment of rising inequality, of rising xenophobia. We've had 58 people were killed in Gaza while we've been at this conference. An 8-month baby was tear gassed to death in Gaza. These issues are of life and death for millions of people around the world. And so I think people of conscience, in whatever field we're in, we have an enormous task ahead of us. And I think it is upon us to not just address these problems inside our silos, but to figure out how we can start working together. And this is an amazing opportunity to meet many of you, but also to think about how we never leave behind the people that are most impacted by these problems, and that we center their voices in being able to design the future that we all believe in. So thank you.